Without change, something sleeps inside us. The sleeper must awaken.
Hello and welcome back to another We Ourselves video. It seems that a lot of current YouTubers can't let go of this fantasy that the 1980s and 1990s were a golden age of pure storytelling that did not worry about inclusion, DEI, wokeness, or targeting certain underrepresented audiences. In fact, this era was the exact opposite of this rose-colored version of Hollywood that you want to see. And I want to talk about that today. I follow a number of YouTube content creators, and like so many of us did during the pandemic, I turned to YouTube as an alternative to the regular Hollywood offerings. And so I discovered more and more people who were doing these shows, but I was watching a recent video by a content creator and they were complaining that they had to move away from a certain YouTuber because they revealed their real bigotry. And I like to think of it as that wake-up call that we all get with a lot of these channels, particularly when so many of them started doing the live presentations, the 3-hour-long presentations instead of edited video content. Even though there are some YouTubers and content creators who never said that dreaded line, and you know what it is, go woke and go broke, yet all of them seem to say the same thing, that they long for the days in the 80s and the 90s when TV shows, genre media, the cartoons, things like that did not focus on representation, but only focused in on good stories. They long for the day, in their mind, when you didn't have people standing up and saying that they represented this culture, this sexuality, or this race, or this gender. Because in their own way, their own low-key way, they want to make genre media great again. And there's only one problem. That golden age that all of them hearken back to, this age of non-wokeness, was exactly the opposite of what they are trying to portray. The 80s and the 90s certainly targeted audiences. They certainly went for inclusion, and we seem to have forgotten that. We forgot that we came out of the 1960s and then we had the 70s, and you had a lot of representation enter into the film and television area. You started to get your first TV shows that starred people of color in any significant numbers. There's always been one or two throughout the years, like with Bill Cosby on I Spy, or I think Diane Carroll, she did a show, but she was a single black woman with a son. So was that good representation or not? But in the 70s and the mid-70s, going into the 80s, that's when you started to get more and more representation. The buddy cop movie became a thing. Actors like Chris Tucker, Eddie Murphy, and Danny Glover, along with Mel Gibson, they were the leaders in these types of movies. Why do you think the studios developed buddy cop movies? We were in an age of representation. Now, of course, things began to go backwards when a certain president came into office, and it forced a former first lady to say that racism had become fashionable again. It's amazing how things repeat themselves in this country. But even in the midst of that, you still had amazing representation all the way into the 2000s. I mean, you had Nickelodeon that came along, and look at all the shows that featured black performers and other performers. It's like you had a wealth of representation. So no, the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s was not this golden age of non-identity, non-politics, or nothing like that in genre media, because the attitude was just the opposite. It was full of representation, and that showed up in two of the OG franchises, Star Wars and Star Trek. I see a lot of the Star Wars creators equate bad storytelling with the drive to include. The idea that you can, from the outset, decide that you want to have, say, women in the front or as a main representation, or you want to have black people as a part of your representation, or you want to have LGBTQ characters, they automatically assume that you're throwing away good storytelling. The determination to be inclusive has nothing to do with whether the story is good or not. What's happening in a lot of the cases with Disney and Marvel and other properties is you have people who aren't from those underrepresented groups who also don't even try to tell compelling stories because at the end of the day, they don't really care, or they really don't believe in representation, or they don't care for the group. But yet, if they're not writing the stories themselves, they are the ones who are making decisions, and they are standing over the storytellers, keeping them from telling compelling stories. They are the ones that are just clicking a box, but that's on them. Inclusive stories can be just as compelling as the good old non-inclusive stories from this imagined greater past. And so many of these content creators, in particular, if you look at Star Wars content creators, they always use this line to talk about why the current Star Wars writing is so bad. But I have to point out to them, George Lucas, the OG himself, targeted underrepresented groups. Why do you think he came up with Lando Calrissian and hired Billy D. Williams to play him? Back in the day, Billy D. Williams, he was a sex symbol, a ladies' man, and a leading man, and he was meant to draw in a black audience, particularly a male audience, so George Lucas chose Billy D. Williams as a way to be inclusive and draw in black Star Wars fans, period. And when we come to the prequels, he chose Samuel L. Jackson for the same reason. So even the OG himself, Mr. Star Wars, chose to include black men in his trilogies. He deliberately chose that inclusion for that reason. And that was in the 1980s, hello, and then in the early 2000s with the prequels. So there has always been deliberate, targeted inclusion in Star Wars. Gene Roddenberry specifically chose the makeup of the command crew of the Enterprise to represent underrepresented audiences. So even way back then in the 1960s, you had white men who were making deliberate decisions to be inclusive. And no real Star Trek fan can ever argue that that original series is not top of the line. In fact, the ones who complain about the current Star Trek always harken back to the good storytelling of the originals. Those stories hit you over the head with their concepts. And he deliberately chose a diverse crew, a command crew, to helm the Starship Enterprise. It was a deliberate choice, and it did not hamper the solid story writing. Back in the day, when Star Trek Deep Space Nine premiered with a lead black actor, we black Star Trek fans, we were ecstatic because Avery Brooks would play Commander Benjamin Sisko. And of all the captains, yes, he later became captain of the USS Defiant, a fact that the fans themselves, the Star Trek fans, had to remind Paramount when the studio excluded him from an advertisement featuring all the Star Trek captains. But as I was saying, of all the captains and commanding officers, Sisko's personal tragic story and introduction was far more in-depth than the other captains, including Captain Kirk. Sisko was the first officer on a ship during the infamous Borg attack at Wolf 359. If you know, you know. His wife, a fellow officer, and son were on board the ship. Now, unfortunately, his wife gets killed, and Sisko has to take his son and leave her behind, watching from the escape pod as the ship explodes. Sisko's now a single father, and you can't get a more involved and sympathetic characterization than that. But somehow, to some white Star Trek fans, particularly male Star Trek fans, the character of Sisko hadn't proved anything to them. And I don't even want to mention how other white male Star Trek fans insisted that DS9 did not go 7 years like Next Generation and Voyager. Of course, that's not accurate. It also went 7 years. Before anyone tries to argue with me, I literally had white Star Trek fans make both of the previous statements and even try to argue the points. The really interesting thing, that of all the Rick Berman era Star Trek shows that didn't reach 7 years, only one met that criteria, and that was Star Trek Enterprise, a show that went back to the old formula where the white males were firmly in the lead with the characters of colors relegated to a second-tier status. Let's not forget Star Trek Voyager, which came out in 1995. Voyager featured a female captain, Captain Janeway, a black Vulcan, Tuvok, an Asian bridge officer, Harry Kim, a clearly identified Native American First Officer, Chakotay, and a Klingon security officer, B'Elanna Torres. Voyager was as diverse as Star Trek had ever been on TV back in the 1990s, and it also lasted 7 years. I can't tell you the number of professional women who were impressed that the USS Voyager had a female captain. Captain Janeway was an inspiration to these professional women in their real lives. So again, when it comes to the two OG properties, Star Wars and Star Trek, back in the 1980s, the 1990s, and the early 2000s, they were very progressive. They were very representative, and it was targeted representation that did not preclude good storylines. But there's something that really gets to me when I see these primarily straight white men complaining about inclusion on these YouTube channels. Of all the people in this country, you have always been the target audience. In genre media, you have always been the default audience. And it became so normalized that you didn't even have to spell it out. The focus has always been, and the consideration has always been, on white males. And George Lucas himself included black men as needed representation in his original Star Wars movies. It was deliberate and not organic. There was an original show called Mantis back in 1995, hello, the 90s, that starred Carl Lumbly as Dr. Miles Hawkins, aka the Mantis. It was executive produced by Sam Raimi, and Sam Hamm wrote the pilot. And here's the Amazon synopsis. Executive producer Sam Raimi presents the cult hit action series. Carl Lumbly portrays a brilliant wheelchair-bound scientist who invents a form of exoskeleton called the mechanically augmented neurotransmitter system, Mantis, that turns him into a superhero and gives him the ability to fight the crime wave that is engulfing his city. An overpowering depiction of an African-American superhero. Two white men wrote this show that focused on a black superhero with black characters around him working with issues in the black community, including the fact that he was shot and paralyzed by a cop. Mantis, in the original pilot, had two African assistants. There was a coroner, a black woman, whose boss, a crusty old white guy, complained that she was an affirmative action hire. That's a political and social justice topic. Again, written by two white men. There was a black reporter who worked with the coroner and Mantis who would feed him information. And even the car that Mantis drove in the pilot was popular in the black community. But the network was concerned about all this black representation because we all know that the largest audience for comic books and superheroes are straight white males. So the studio wanted to target those white males, even though the show was supposed to target a black audience. Let's hear that. Even though the show was developed by two white men to target the black audience, to speak to a black audience, to give a black audience representation, the studio still wanted to include white men. And so they didn't care about the original focus. The white male gaze was more important, so the studio whitewashed the show. That means they either race-swapped characters or deleted existing black characters in favor of totally new characters. And I've started a series a while back on my channel where I talked about the whitewashing of characters and how diversity, meaning whitewashing, happened to us before we ever got to this current era of, as you say, making stuff that nobody asked for by inserting politics, gender, or race into the narrative. You know, all that pesky stuff that is antithetical to good storytelling, supposedly. What was done to the Mantis TV show was one of the most notorious examples of whitewashing a property that was meant to be about black people and the black culture. For example, the two African assistants were replaced with a pale English guy. He became the Mantis's guy in the chair. The reporter was replaced with a wisecracking white male bike courier. And the coroner was replaced with a biracial police lieutenant, the only other color on the show. And all of this was done because the studio wanted to appeal and target straight white men, who they felt were the majority of the audience for genre media and therefore more important than having a black audience. We are all culturally conditioned to accept this greater than less than attitude when it comes to the audience. For example, when I decided to write my first YA epic adventure, which centered on black kids and a black main character, I had a friend say to me, well, you have to have your character's best friend be white. And I said, why? Why would he say that to me? Because if we aren't careful and courageous, we can become concerned with the white gaze also. Just like the studio that whitewashed the Mantis show, we ourselves will make concessions in the effort to not offend a white audience, even though what we're doing, we say, are really for black people to fill that gap in the current offerings out there in the media. But that's what cultural conditioning does to all of us. For those who don't remember the definition, here it is. It comes from the late Joe Madison. And he used to say all the time on his show, in America, we are all culturally conditioned to believe that white is superior and black is inferior. And the cultural manifestation of that conditioning is that black people are underestimated, undervalued, and marginalized. And if we aren't careful, we ourselves will fall for that, and we will be overly concerned of what the white gaze will say about whatever the creative projects that we produce represent. A lot of Star Wars content creators, some of the biggest ones, always make that argument about the bad storytelling and inclusion. And they sit there and they act like we don't see between the lines, that we don't understand what they're saying. We get it. You long for a day where white males are in the leads and there's nothing to distract you from sitting down and watching the story by a guy, most times, who looks like you, so that you can step into that role and feel what they are feeling, what the character is feeling, that you can put yourself in their situation. But for some reason, when it comes to anybody else who doesn't look like you, you can't do that. So you use words like badly written, badly acted, because maybe a person of color doesn't emote in a certain situation the same way you expect it to be. That doesn't mean it's not as good, but we hear that a lot. We hear that nobody asked for this film or that TV show. The movie you didn't go see because, nobody asked for it, because you decided you didn't want it. I had a friend, a fellow writer, who said at a convention on a panel discussion, he said that as a black man growing up, he had to learn early in life that if he wanted to enjoy the majority of the genre, sci-fi and fantasy offerings out there, the OG offerings, he had to get over not seeing himself represented. That's how he and we approached it. Now, it doesn't mean that we did not then go forward to make sure we had representation by picking up the task and writing our own and producing our own original works. But the reason that we were able to get over not seeing ourselves is because we, black people, FBA, ADOS, however you want to define us, we have no problem going to a movie and rooting for white characters. We have no problem crying at the right time for white characters. We don't have a problem with inclusion. Like I said, we're a disproportionate number of the American box office, but we don't have the movies that represent that proportion of the dollars that we put into Hollywood, particularly going to theaters and movies. Same thing with TV shows. You saw that back in the day with cable subscriptions. In some areas, the cable companies had like a 60 or 70% African-American subscriber base, but when it came to channels that represented that huge African-American percentage of the subscribers, the content was all but non-existent. Except for BET and later TV One, you didn't have any cable channels that offered content aimed at a black audience. That's why they got the class action lawsuit against them. And that also meant that we were subscribing to services and we were watching stuff that largely did not picture us. Again, we have never had a problem with inclusion. We don't have a problem with accepting other people. We don't have a problem with rooting for other people and even working to help other people. The problem is when people were asked to broaden their minds and embrace something or someone that didn't look like them, they threw a hissy fit. And now they want to legislate stuff away. They want to do executive orders and get rid of this and that. They want to pull back on civil rights, and they've been pulling back on civil rights since it was enacted. And they want to do all this stuff as if they still aren't the center of the American universe, while other people inside and outside this country are watching us and just shaking their head. On the other hand, we, Black Americans, FBA, ADOS, we have no problem rooting for people who do not look like us. MCU fans who are not white males, they were moved when the portals opened in Avengers Endgame. We were moved when Tony Stark died. We clapped and cheered for Chris Evans, Captain America, when he called Thor's hammer and when he shouted Avengers Assemble. We clapped and cheered when Chris Hemsworth's Thor appeared on the Wakanda battlefield in Avengers Infinity War with his new Stormbreaker hammer. We had no problem cheering for people that did not look like us. So why do fans who don't look like us have such a problem with doing the same thing? And why do fans who don't look like us wish for a fictional age where you didn't have to deal with inclusion and DEI? Or an age where you didn't have to worry about properties focusing in on the fact that a character was black or gay or a woman? It seems like you're upset because you're not the center of the universe, even though you are. You're equating inclusion with bad story writing, not realizing or deliberately ignoring that the people who are writing the bad stories look just like you. If Hollywood had true representation, i.e. true representation in the C-suites and at the real power levels, you wouldn't have the bad story writing in these inclusive shows. And I'll give you a what if as I close. Does anybody in this world imagine that if the Acolyte showrunner had been Shonda Rhimes, do you think it would have had bad storytelling? No, it wouldn't. And we all know that. The Acolyte would have really been about the Sith and not a backhanded takedown of the concept of the Jedi. And even if it was, Shonda Rhimes would have still knocked it out of the park. Amandla Stenberg's character would have been dynamic because Rhimes would not have let a weak story go out. And why? Because we, Black Americans, FBA, ADOS, however you want to call yourself, we understand that when we're at that level, we have to perform because people are judging us. They are looking at us and they are ready to jump on any mistake we make. That storyline for the Acolyte, if Shonda Rhimes had been the showrunner, would have been the best thing that you had ever seen for Star Wars. It would have sizzled. It would have leapt off the screen. It would have made even hardcore fanboys happy. Instead, it was given to Leslie Headland. And she doesn't really care about the inclusion because she's going to land on her feet because of her privilege. And that's the problem with the bad storytelling in genre media when it comes to inclusive and diverse characters. Now, don't get me wrong, it does not happen 100% of the time. Just look at Andor. That series was just as diverse as The Acolyte, but it has avoided all the inclusion and DEI attacks because the showrunner paid attention to the story while being inclusive and diverse with the cast. The two concepts are not mutually exclusive. We don't have to go back to some fictional age, i.e. the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s, where we supposedly just had good storytelling that did not focus in on representation. The truth is, Hollywood has always focused in on identity from its very beginning, even if that meant suppressing other identities or diluted anything that made it to the screen. No matter how you look at it, their attention has always been on identity. As always, like and subscribe, leave your comments, hit the like button if you haven't, and please subscribe to the channel. And I appreciate all of those people who have already subscribed. And of course, share the video, and I will see you next time.